Road trips are often seen as the ultimate adventure, freedom, open skies, and the thrill of the unknown. But what if that unknown isn't as inviting as it seems? Often romanticized as journeys of freedom and discovery, but beneath the surface, there's something unnerving about road trips, isn't there? The open road stretching endlessly ahead, but then the landscapes blur, the silence grows heavier. When the road you thought you knew becomes a path to terror. These are not just stories. They're warnings of what can happen when the road takes a sinister turn. I've always loved road trips. There's a certain freedom in the open highway, the lines of asphalt stretching out like an invitation to escape. On this particular trip, I was driving through a stretch of highway so desolate that I didn't see another car for miles. The sun hung low in the sky, casting an orange hue over the barren landscape. It was one of those moments that made you feel small, but also in control, as if the world beyond the road didn't exist. I had been driving for hours, my fingers tapping idly on the steering wheel as I scanned the horizon. Just as the sun dipped below the horizon, I spotted a figure on the side of the road, a hitchhiker. His thumb was out, and for a moment I considered just driving by. But something about the solitude of the highway made the thought of company appealing. After all, I had another 200 miles to go before the next town, and the idea of silence was beginning to weigh on me. I slowed down, pulling over just ahead of him. He jogged up to the car with a grin that looked both grateful and relieved. His clothes were worn but clean, and there was an easy confidence in the way he carried himself as he slid into the passenger seat. "Thanks, man. Been out here for a while," he said. His voice casual, almost too casual for the situation. "No problem," I replied, forcing a smile. "Where are you headed?" He paused for a second, his eyes flicking toward the road. "Just down the highway. You can drop me off whenever." There was something off about the way he avoided specifics, but I brushed it aside. Maybe he was just another drifter, someone looking for a fresh start, or maybe he didn't know where he was going. I could relate to that. We drove in silence for a while, the only sound the rumble of the tires against the cracked pavement. "So," I said, breaking the quiet, "what brings you out here?" He hesitated before responding, as if weighing whether to share. "Well, just needed to get away for a bit. You know, life can get complicated." I nodded, though I didn't entirely understand. His response felt vague, like he was hiding something. I glanced over at him, and he caught my eye, offering a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. We continued like that for a while, exchanging pleasantries and small talk. But the more he spoke, the more uneasy I became. His stories didn't add up. He mentioned coming from a town that didn't exist, told tales that seemed rehearsed, each one lacking the small details that make a memory real. It was subtle at first, just small inconsistencies. But as the miles rolled by, I started to notice other things. The way his smile would drop when he thought I wasn't looking. How he would stare out the window for long stretches, his fingers drumming rhythmically on the door, almost like a nervous tick. And then there was the way he avoided talking about himself in any real detail. As night fell, the air in the car grew thick with tension. The conversations had tapered off, leaving only the sound of the road and the occasional sigh from the hitchhiker. I had a feeling that something was wrong. My mind raced through scenarios, none of them good. I found myself gripping the wheel tighter, my foot hovering over the gas pedal, as if I could outrun the growing sense of dread. The hitchhiker, sensing my discomfort, leaned back in his seat and chuckled softly. "You seem tense," he said, his voice lower now, almost predatory. "Don't worry, I'm not as bad as you think." His words hung in the air like a threat, and I felt my pulse quicken. I wanted to believe he was joking, that this was just some twisted sense of humor. But the darkness in his tone told me otherwise. I glanced at the road sign ahead, Only 20 miles to the next town. I could make it. I had to. The hitchhiker shifted in his seat, his eyes locked on the road ahead. "You ever pick someone up and wish you hadn't?" he asked. His voice barely above a whisper. I didn't answer. My throat felt dry, my mind racing with possibilities. What had I gotten myself into? I kept my eyes on the road, willing the miles to pass faster. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him reach into his jacket. My heart leapt into my throat, and instinctively I pressed harder on the gas. "Relax," he said, pulling out nothing more than a cigarette. He lit it slowly, the glow from the flame briefly illuminating his face, casting shadows that made him look older, more sinister. But something told me not to relax. Not yet. The next town came into view, a small cluster of lights against the dark horizon. Relief flooded through me, but I kept my face neutral, not wanting to show him how desperate I was to get out of the car. As we neared the exit, I spoke, keeping my voice calm. "This is where I'll drop you," I said. He didn't argue, just smiled that same unsettling smile. "Thanks for the ride," he said. His voice casual again, as if we hadn't just spent the last few hours in a silent game of psychological cat and mouse. He got out, gave me a small wave, and then walked into the night, disappearing into the shadows. I didn't wait to see where he went. The moment he was out of sight, I sped off, not stopping until I was miles away from that place. Till date, I don't know what his story really was, but every time I think about picking up a stranger on the road, I remember that night. That day, for some reason, I didn't feel like taking my car. But instead, I wanted to just travel by train as I very often did. Some days by train, or take a bus or a cab ride at times. I love traveling through different means of transport, so I don't settle with a small view. The whole day went blissful. I had some important work on the outskirts, which I did and was heading back home. But as luck would have it, I missed the last train by minutes. The empty platform stretched before me, its silence broken only by the occasional flicker of the ancient station lights. The chill in the air seeped into my bones, and I pulled my jacket tighter, glancing at the clock overhead. It was an old-fashioned mechanical thing with faded numbers and tarnished hands. 11:45 p.m. Except the hands weren't moving. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me after a long day of travel. But no, they were frozen in place, stuck at a time that no longer matched the hour. The clock was broken. I told myself nothing more. The station was almost deserted. Almost. I wasn't alone. A few others stood scattered along the platform, their figures hunched against the cold, faces hidden beneath hats and scarves. They didn't move much, just stood there, like statues waiting for something to happen. None of them seemed to notice me, or the clock, or the eerie quiet that settled over the station like a heavy fog. I walked over to one of the benches and sat down, hoping the next train wouldn't be too far off. My phone was dead, naturally, and there were no schedules posted anywhere in sight. Just a dimly lit platform, a handful of people, and that damn clock ticking away time that no longer seemed to pass. For a while, I just sat there, trying to calm the growing unease in my chest. Maybe I'd catch the first train in the morning. Maybe there was a midnight service I wasn't aware of. The details didn't matter, not really. What mattered was that gnawing feeling creeping up the back of my neck. That feeling when you're alone. Suddenly, I heard a voice. Waiting for the next one. The voice startled me. I looked up to see a man standing near the bench, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of an old, threadbare coat. His eyes were dark, sunken, and he smiled at me, though there was nothing comforting in it. "Yeah," I replied slowly. "Missed the last train. Do you know when the next one's coming?" The man chuckled softly. "Depends on where you're going." I was skeptical. "What do you mean?" I asked. He tilted his head, his smile fading just a little. "Not all trains go to the same place. You're sure you know where you're headed?" Home, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I'm going home. He watched me for a long moment, his gaze unwavering, and I suddenly felt exposed, like he could see right through me. Then, with a slight nod, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows at the far end of the platform. I exhaled, realizing I'd been holding my breath. Something about the way he looked at me, the way he spoke, had set my nerves on edge. I glanced around, trying to find someone else who looked more normal. Someone I could talk to, who could tell me how long I'd be stuck here. That's when I noticed a woman sitting alone near the edge of the platform, her back turned to me. She rocked slightly, her head moving in rhythm with the subtle sway of her body. It was an odd movement, almost hypnotic. I stood up, hesitant but curious. Maybe she knew something. Maybe she'd been waiting longer than I had. As I approached her, I heard her muttering under her breath. It was soft, almost too low to catch, but the closer I got, the clearer it became. She was talking to herself, repeating the same phrase over and over. They never leave. They never leave. Excuse me, I said, my voice trembling despite myself. She stopped rocking, her muttering silencing in an instant. Slowly, she turned to face me, her eyes wide and bloodshot, her skin pale and drawn. There was something wild about her, something barely contained, as though she was holding herself together by sheer force of will. They never leave, she whispered. We're all still here. I took a step back, my heart racing. What do you mean? Her gaze drifted to the clock. We've all been waiting, but the train never comes. Not for us. I followed her eyes to the clock. 11:45 p.m. Still broken, still frozen. It didn't make sense. I'd only been here for half an hour, maybe less. How long had she been here? How long had any of them been here? Before I could ask another question, a loud screech echoed through the station, and I turned toward the sound. A train. Finally, I could see its headlights piercing through the darkness, growing larger as it approached. The woman didn't move. The man with the threadbare coat didn't reappear. The others on the platform didn't react at all. They just stood there, silent, unmoving, as the train screeched to a halt in front of us. The doors slid open with a soft hiss, and I hesitated. Something was wrong. No one else was getting on. No one even acknowledged the train's arrival. It was like I was the only one who could see it. I glanced back at the woman. She was staring at me now, her lips trembling. Don't, she whispered. Once you get on, you don't come back. The words sent a shiver down my spine. I stepped away from the train. This wasn't right. None of it was right. But what choice did I have? Stay here in this strange, liminal place with these people, or take the train and hope it took me home? Before I could make a decision, the man in the threadbare coat appeared again, standing just behind me. His smile was back, wider now, almost too wide for his face. Time to go, he said. The train doesn't wait. I turned to face him, the panic rising in my throat. Where does it go? His smile faded, replaced by a look of something darker. Wherever you need it to. Suddenly, the train's horn blared, a deafening sound that reverberated through the station. I stumbled back, torn between getting on and staying behind, trapped in this nightmare of a station that seemed frozen in time. But the others didn't move. The woman stayed on the bench, rocking slowly again. The man, on the other hand, watched me, his hands still in his pockets, his gaze unreadable. I stepped toward the train, the urge to escape overwhelming every rational thought in my mind. As I did, the doors began to close. I hesitated again, my hand hovering just above the handle. In that moment, I knew, whether I stayed or got on, there was no going back. Not really. With a final glance at the clock, 11:45 p.m., I pulled my hand away, watching as the doors slid shut and the train pulled away, disappearing into the darkness. The station fell silent once more, and I was still there, waiting. I've always enjoyed taking the road less traveled. The thrill of venturing into unknown territory, relying on nothing but a map and my instincts. That's how I ended up on that narrow, winding back road, a decision I would come to regret. I had been driving for hours, my GPS stubbornly refusing to reconnect. The sun was setting, casting shadows across the trees lining the road, and I still hadn't seen a single car or sign of civilization. Just as the last bit of daylight began to fade, I saw a small town nestled between the hills, like something out of a postcard. The buildings were quaint, with bright, cheerful paint and flower boxes in the windows. A sign at the edge of town welcomed me in, though the letters were faded, barely legible. Relieved to see life again. I pulled into the main street. There were people milling about, chatting, smiling. It was a strange kind of friendliness, the sort you don't usually find in small towns where strangers are treated with suspicion. But here, everyone seemed eager to greet me, waving as I drove by. I parked the car and got out, intending to ask for directions. A woman approached me almost immediately, her smile wide and welcoming. "Lost, are you?" she asked in a sweet, melodic voice. "Yeah, actually. I took a wrong turn, and now my GPS isn't working. Could you point me to the nearest highway?" Her smile didn't falter. "Oh, don't worry. You're safe here. We don't get many visitors, but those who come always find their way back." I chuckled awkwardly, brushing off her strange comment. "Thanks, but I really just need to get back on the road," I said. "Why don't you stay for the night?" she suggested. "We have a lovely inn just down the street. You'll be much safer here than out on the road after dark." I glanced around. The sun had almost completely set, and the thought of driving through unfamiliar territory in the dark wasn't exactly appealing. Maybe staying the night wasn't such a bad idea. Reluctantly, I agreed, and she led me to the inn, a charming old-fashioned building with a cozy porch and flickering lanterns. Inside, the air smelled like fresh bread, and the fireplace crackled warmly. The innkeeper, an older man with a kind smile, handed me a key and showed me to my room. It was nice, almost too nice for such a small town. But there was something off about the people, something in the way they watched me, always smiling, always too friendly. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't sleep, trying to make sense of the strange atmosphere. Then, in the dead of night, I heard a soft knock at my door. I didn't move. I thought I would have overheard it. The knock came again, followed by a whisper. "Wake up." My breath caught in my throat. For a moment, I lay there motionless, trying to convince myself I had imagined it. The room was dead silent, except for the soft crackling of the fireplace downstairs. But the whisper had felt too real, too close. I sat up, straining my ears for any other sounds, but there was nothing. No footsteps retreating down the hallway, no movement outside my door. I debated whether to open the door or stay where I was. Logic told me it was a prank or someone from the town messing with me. Something didn't feel right, something about the way the whole town seemed too perfect, too staged. Though everyone was acting out a part, they didn't quite believe in themselves. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and quietly crept to the door, pressing my ear against the wood. There was no sound, no hint of movement. I slowly turned the handle, opening the door, just a crack. The hallway was empty, bathed in the faint orange glow from the lanterns lining the walls. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I stepped out, my bare feet making almost no sound. I glanced left and right, expecting to see someone pranking me, just a friendly one so to speak, but the inn was completely still. It was that stillness that unnerved me. Everything seemed too quiet. I crept down the stairs, my footsteps deliberately soft. The lobby was just as deserted as it had been when I arrived. The innkeeper's desk stood vacant. I approached the front door, hoping to slip out unnoticed, but when I reached for the handle, it wouldn't budge. The door was locked tight. Panic surged through me. I rattled the door softly, trying not to make noise, but it didn't move. My fingers fumbled for a latch, a lock, anything that would open it, but it was as if the door had been sealed shut from the outside. I glanced back toward the stairs, expecting to see someone watching me. I turned toward the windows, trying to peer out into the street, but the curtains were drawn tight, as though the town was deliberately shut off from the outside world. The whole place felt suffocating. That's when I noticed a faint murmur of voices. Low and distinct, but definitely. I couldn't make out the words, but they were coming from outside, drifting through the thin walls of the inn. The tone was unmistakable, though hushed, conspiratorial, like people speaking just loud enough to avoid being heard. I backed away from the door and made my way to one of the side windows, carefully pulling back the edge of the curtain. Through the glass, I saw a small group of townspeople standing in the street. Their backs were to me, but their postures were stiff, unnatural. The woman who had first greeted me stood among them. Her head turned slightly, as though she was listening for something. The same strange smile still plastered on her face. My heart drumming in my chest as they whispered to one another, occasionally glancing toward the inn. It was clear they knew I was still inside. I stepped away from the window, terrified at this point, not knowing what to do. What were they planning? Why wouldn't they let me leave? I made my way back upstairs, moving quickly but quietly. The knot of fear in my stomach tightened with every step. There was something terribly wrong with this place, something beneath the surface that they weren't saying, but I could feel it in every glance, every false smile. Back in my room, I locked the door and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the small clock on the nightstand. The seconds ticked by, painfully slow. I tried to come up with a plan, some way to get out without attracting their attention, but every option seemed futile. I could try to escape through a window, but the moment they heard me, I'd be caught. I lay down, replaying every interaction with the townspeople in my head, trying to find an explanation for why they seemed so desperate to keep me here. I thought back to the innkeeper's smile, the way the woman had insisted I stay. Something about their overly friendly demeanor now felt like a trap. The night dragged on, and the whispers outside eventually faded. But even as the town grew quiet, I could literally feel as though their eyes were on me, waiting for me to make a move. I tried to sleep, but every creak of the building, every gust of wind outside jolted me awake. The feeling of suffocating unease never left. By morning, I made up my mind. I had to leave no matter what. Even if I had to walk through the woods or hitchhike the rest of the way, I couldn't stay here another night. When I went downstairs, the innkeeper was waiting by the door, his smile as kind and unsettling as ever. "Leaving already?" he asked, his tone light, but his eyes sharp. I forced a smile and nodded. "Yeah, I have to get back on the road. Thanks for the stay." He didn't move, just stood there, blocking the exit with that same unnerving grin. "You'll come back, won't you?" he asked, but it wasn't a question. It was more of a statement, one that gave me goosebumps. I managed a weak laugh, edging toward the door. "Maybe, sometime." I swallowed hard as I said it. He stepped aside, and I felt a rush of relief as I slipped out the door and into the cool morning air. But as I walked to my car, I could feel their eyes on me again. The woman, the townspeople, all watching from their doorsteps, their smiles never quite reaching their eyes. I didn't look back as I drove away, but even as I left the town behind, the unease lingered. There was something wrong with that place, with those people. And no matter how far I drove, the feeling followed me. And the worst part, I couldn't escape from the suspicion that someday, somehow, I'd find myself back there.